Today we're going to learn how to add and subtract radicals. In the previous lesson we learned how to take one radical and simplify them. Today we're going to have multiple expressions with radicals and we're going to learn how to make them smaller or simpler. Now adding and subtracting radicals is actually very similar to combining like terms. So a lot of the steps that we're going to take when simplifying radicals is just going to be very similar to what we do when we have multiple expressions that we want to combine. So if you were very good with combining like terms, this should be a pretty familiar lesson to you. So the first thing that you want to do is, you remember when we did combining like terms, we talked about first names and last names, right? So we talked about if we had something like 2x and 5x, okay, 2 and 5 were the first. Let's say we have 2x plus 5x, 2 and 5 were our first names, and the variable was our last name. And we said, well, if we're combining these two things, we're going to take the first names, 2 and positive 5, combine them to give us 7, because 2 plus positive 5 gives me 7, and then we keep their last name of x. Well, when we're simplifying radicals, it's the same concept, except that the last names now are actually going to be what's under the radical. So for example, in example number 1, the last name for this term is square root of 3, and the last name for this term is square root of 3 as well. The first name here is 2, and the first name here is positive 5. So if I want to combine these two things, what I want to do is I want to take their first name, so I want to do 2 plus 5, and that gives me 7, and then I keep their last name, which is radical 3. So 2 radical 3 plus 5 radical 3, it's actually equal to 7 square root of 3. What I don't want you to do in this lesson is just simply put this in the calculator and give me the decimal that it gives you. We can all do that. We can all plug this into the calculator. This lesson is not about getting a final value for it. This lesson is about simplifying things. So how do I make this simpler? How do I combine things that have the same last name? So all your answers today should have a radical as part of your final answer. It should not be a decimal. So we can have a simple problem like that where there's only one last name of radical 3, or we can have an example like example 2 where there are things that have different last names. So for example, here the last name is radical 2, the last name here is radical 3, here is radical 3, and over here is square root of 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine things that have the same last names. So if I rearrange this, and this is an optional step, but it's a step that helps you see things clear, and it's also a step that you can use to show your work on your task. Because on your task, I don't just want a final answer. I want you to show me the things that you're combining, whether that it's in words or using what I'm about to show you now. So I can rearrange this so that things that have the same last name are next to each other if it's easier for me to see. So I see that I have 3 radical 2. The other thing that has a radical 2 is this negative 12 radical 2. And remember to always bring a sign that is next to the coefficient or the number outside of the radical. So I have 3 radical 2, then I have negative 12 radical 2. Now the other last name here is radical 3, so I have negative 6 radical 3, and I have positive 3 radical 3. So now I know the things that I need to combine. I have 3 plus negative 12, so I'm going to put in my calculator 3 plus negative 12, and 3 plus negative 12, 3 plus negative 12, that's what I put in my calculator. 3 plus negative 12 actually gives me negative 9, and I keep the last name. So that's negative 9 radical 2, because 3 plus negative 12 is negative 9, or 3 minus 12 is negative 9. And now I'm going to combine these two things. So I have negative 6 plus 3, which gives me negative 3. So I bring down that negative 3. And again, I keep the last name, and that's my final answer. Because radical 2 and radical 3 are two different last names, I can't combine anything any further. Okay, you cannot combine things where the radical where the number inside and under the radical is different. I can only combine things that have the same number under the square root or the radical. Now, just a few tips. If there is a term that has nothing to be combined with, so let's say that I added here a, I don't know, positive a square root 7. There's nothing else with a square root 7 in this problem. So if I were to have something like this where there's nothing else to combine it, but we will do the same thing as we would when we're combining like terms, and it's just bring it down. I will bring this down here, including its sign, right? If it's a positive, I put plus, and if it's a negative, I put minus, and I just bring that down. The other thing that you can see is you can see a radical without a number next to it. So for example, let's say that I had I don't know, 6, let's say that I just had square root 6. Well, let's say I had, I'm going to do 2 radical 6 plus square root 6. If I had something like that where there's no number outside of the radical, again, we're treating this radical 6 as if it were a variable. So the same way if I had an x that had no number next to it, there's always a 1 there. Well, it's the same concept when we're looking at radicals or square root. There's a 1 before that. So this would actually just be 2 plus 1, which is 3. And again, we keep the last names. So those are just some certain things you want to look out for when you're doing your task. Remember your negatives. Remember to show your work, whether that's in words or using or rearranging the terms to show what you're going to combine. And remember, if the radical has no number next to it, then there's a 1 there.